From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, this is From the South, and I'm Camila Escalante. At least 4 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli security forces during rallies marking the anniversary of the Great March of Return. According to the Palestinian Health Authority, 2 of the victims were minors. Over 300 people have also been injured during the protests and referred to hospitals. Hours before the rallies, Israel deployed dozens of tanks and armored vehicles along the border with Gaza. Tens of thousands of Palestinians have rallied at the Gaza border against the decades-long Israeli occupation. The protest also commemorates the 43rd anniversary of Land Day, when 6 people were killed in 1976 during demonstrations against the seizure of Arab land in Galilee. Nearly 270 Palestinians have been killed by the Israeli military since the weekly March of Return protests began last March of last year. Now let's take a look at the major events which have occurred since Palestinians launched the Great March of Return to demand to go back to their ancestral land.
On behalf of the 45th President of the United States of America, we welcome you officially and for the first time to the Embassy of the United States here in Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. Thank you.
As these diplomats from the United States and Israel cheered and celebrated the opening of the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem, just 70 kilometers away, unarmed Palestinians were being hit by live ammunition from the Israeli army on the Gaza border. Among the victims were women and children. Within hours, at least 60 Palestinians were killed, the highest death toll in 10 years. For these fearless protesters, Israeli weapons cannot stop them from fighting for their right to return to their homeland, and death is the least of their worries.
I got injured at the border, and even though I was hurt, I still returned to the separating fence. We aren't afraid of their snipers, not even of their tanks.
By the end of the day, almost 400 Palestinians were wounded in violent attacks at the Gaza-Israel border, bloodshed on an unprecedented scale. What caused Palestinians to risk taking bullets and gunfire was the changing of the status of the city they call their future capital, East Jerusalem. By moving the embassy of the United States and recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, President Donald Trump made it very clear he is taking the side of Israel and encouraging brutal violence against the Palestinians, who are left with no option but to stand up against their aggressor. Palestinian children trade their childhood to face the Israel bullets because they too believe their future lies in their land under their rule.
Protesting brothers could not carry me because if they helped me, then the Israeli army would shoot them. Someone tried to pick me up, but the stretcher was too far, like 10 meters away. So he started to run, and while he ran, I felt like my leg was falling off.
Even before this political statement of moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem happened in May, a massive wave of protests known as the Great March of Return had begun at the Israel-Gaza border on the 30th of March, the anniversary of Land Day. It was on this day in 1976 that Israeli police shot and killed 6 Palestinians for protesting against Israel's government expropriation of land. So when the Palestinians launched their Great March of Return, they were met with extreme violence from the heavily armed Israeli forces.
I called today for the United Nations to immediately start to provide international protection to the Palestinian people in the face of these daily aggressions. I blame the Israeli occupation for all of today's casualties caused by the occupation army facing peaceful protests.
Since March 30th last year, the Great March of Return has continued every Friday. Palestinians have gathered in their thousands to build pressure on the Israeli authorities. Israel's attacks on the protesters have led to the death of over 200 Palestinians. More than 10,000 have been wounded. Earlier this month, a United Nations report said that Israel has committed crimes against the protesters that may amount to war crimes. The situation in the Strip became intense on March 25th, when Israeli military launched a series of bombs attacking several locations in northern Gaza. The office of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh was completely destroyed in the attacks. This came after a rocket was allegedly launched from Gaza, hitting Tel Aviv. After a day of bombing, a ceasefire was brokered between Hamas and Israel. The Israeli rockets have stopped hitting, but the violent attacks on innocent protesters continues.
And people across the world have shown their solidarity with Palestine and are condemning Israel's continued occupation of their land. In South Africa, members of the Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party planted an olive tree at the Constitutional Hill in Johannesburg to represent South Africa's commitment to the Palestinian struggle. The Constitutional Hill is a former apartheid-era prison where numerous anti-apartheid activists, including Nelson Mandela, were imprisoned. Rallies were also held across Europe. In Paris, dozens of protesters showed their support and accused President Emmanuel Macron of being an accomplice in Israel's human rights abuses. In London, hundreds of protesters gathered in front of Israel's embassy, calling for justice for Palestinians and for an end to the 12-year-long blockade on Gaza by the State of Israel.
We are here to show our unconditional support to the Palestinians and to the fight they have been carrying out for years. They've been holding the Return March demonstrations for a year, but Western media didn't speak about this. Today we want to show them the support they deserve. It's something forgotten but very important, since nowadays it is the last war of colonization in the world.
And the Arab League has pledged monthly financial support for Palestine. Following the meeting of Arab foreign ministers in Tunisia, the bloc announced its support to the Palestinian National Authority with $100 million each month. They also passed a resolution to reject the Trump administration's recognition of Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights.
In regards to the support of the Palestinian National Authority and supporting it financially, we will implement a financial security net of $100 million per month to the Palestinian National Authority.
Now, for more on Palestine and its ongoing resistance, we're joined by Hammam Farah, the co-founder of the Association of Progressive Palestinian Canadians. Hey, Hammam, great to have you.
Hi, thank you.
First of all, tell us a bit about the significance of today and what we've seen over the past year.
Yes, so today marks the one-year anniversary of the Great March of Return, when tens of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza began marching every Friday to the militarized border fence with Israel. And 1 year on, the situation is quite grim. The Israeli army has killed nearly 300 protesters and injured about 30,000 others. Just today, Israeli snipers killed 2 teenagers and injured 300 others. Palestinians are demanding that Israel lifts the illegal blockade on Gaza and allow Palestinian refugees to their right to return home, as stipulated in UN General Assembly Resolution 194. We have to always remember that Palestinians have now endured 12 years of this illegal blockade, 52 years of Israeli military occupation, and 71 years of mass displacement from their lands in historic Palestine, what essentially became the State of Israel in 1948. They were forcibly removed and expelled into the Gaza Strip. And, we're still waiting for the international community to do its part in holding Israel accountable for its crimes.
And Hammam, it seems like we're seeing an increase of aggression by Israel, particularly within the last few weeks. What are we witnessing?
Oh yes, Israel's general election is happening on the 9th of April. So the recent increase in Israel's aggression should be seen within that context. Netanyahu has hit Gaza with a particularly heavy hand in order to prove himself to the country's right wing and secure his re-election in the wake of his popularity figures are struggling in the polls, and so he has to secure that he has to secure his position as someone who will stand up to Palestinian resistance. And so this is a repeating pattern that we see when Israeli elections are near. We see an increase in Israeli violence against Palestinians as Israeli leaders try to prove themselves to their constituents, which it speaks volumes, about the state of Israeli society, as a country that's overlooking the oldest military occupation in modern history. And also, on top of that, they also wanted to strike Gaza in the past week as a show of force against the protesters today, reminding them of their helplessness in the face of Israeli power. Yeah.
Hammam, can you briefly tell us a bit about this recent UN report on Israel's use of excessive and sometimes lethal force?
Yeah, so I think this is important for the world to know. So an independent UN Commission of Inquiry just recently published a report accusing Israeli soldiers of intentionally firing on civilians, and that their use of lethal force against protesters may amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. The report was adopted by the UN Human Rights Council a week ago and calls for sanctions on individuals responsible for the massacres. So I think this is a really important development. Unfortunately, as we're used to seeing over and over and over again, is that international institutions release reports and statements and UN resolutions, that are quite supportive of the Palestinian struggle for freedom, justice, and equality, and for Palestinian rights, because our rights are enshrined in international law. That's the thing about our struggle, is that it's very compatible. It's very international law is on our side, and that's what's going for Palestinians. But unfortunately, we don't see anything in the way of the international community stepping up its responsibility into pressuring Israel to end its violations, and that has to budge. We have to do a lot more work in order to push our respective institutions to do that.
We're running short on time, but one last question. Since we're speaking to you and you're in Canada right now, tell us about the student movement, BDS, and how Prime Minister Justin Trudeau fits into all of this, and also this IHRA definition of anti-Semitism that has been conflating anti-Semitism with a criticism of Israel. Tell us a bit about how that applies where you are.
Okay, yeah. So the Palestine Solidarity Movement here in Canada, which includes in large part the student movement, recently has adopted the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions campaign, or BDS. So this campaign was demanded by Palestinians and has widespread support around the world, particularly with the grassroots and with the labor unions, with workers and students and the poor and many different associations, and even political parties around the world now, and governments. So it is really growing. And recently, I'm proud to say that the student movement in Canada has adopted it. The Canadian Federation of Students recently passed its resolution recognizing boycott, divestment, and sanctions as the best strategy and tool that we have to pressure Israel to end its violations. Unfortunately, Justin Trudeau and the Liberal government in Canada and the Conservatives, of course, conflate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, and that's what Justin Trudeau did when he accused BDS of conflating the two, and that's just utter nonsense, because BDS absolutely does not conflate the two. It is targeting the Israeli government policy. We have a right to criticize the Israeli government policy and hold Israel accountable for its systematic violations, and there's nothing wrong with that. That needs to happen. And the Canadian government, unfortunately, needs to be pressured to do so. What we see happening instead is a turn towards the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism, which has been gaining ground in recent years as it's being adopted by different governments and institutions. Recently, most notably, the Labour Party in the UK was pressured to adopt the IHRA definition, which conflates anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel. And recently, we're seeing university campuses in Canada. Some student unions have started to adopt it. And just recently, the university that I graduated from, York University, its president announced that the IHRA definition provides a useful approach to anti-Semitism, and we're saying it does not. You have most importantly, I think, a lot of Jewish organizations that stand in solidarity with Palestinians that are working very hard against the IHRA definition, including notably Jewish Voice for Peace in the US and independent Jewish voices here in Canada. So this is a definition that there isn't a consensus among the Jewish community about it. And in fact, recently a poll has shown that the Jewish community in Canada does not agree about how to go about dealing with the Israeli government violations. There are a lot of Jews here in Canada that support boycotting Israel and see it as reasonable in order to pressure the Israeli government to finally respect human rights, as that's what Palestinians are demanding. We're demanding a right to return.
Thanks so much for joining us on this important day. We've been speaking to Hammam Farah. He's a Palestinian Canadian who's joining us from Toronto. Now on to some other news. Thousands of Venezuelans have taken to the streets of Caracas to protest against imperialism and to show their support for the government. Marches set out from several neighborhoods to converge in the center of the capital. They waved flags and chanted slogans like "Long live the homeland" and "Long live President Nicolas Maduro."
From Venezuela, we say to the rest of the world that we want peace. The unity of civilians and the military want peace as well. We have dignity. We are loyal to our government.
The president of the National Constituent Assembly, Diosdado Cabello, told the crowd that it's time to be alert and said that the Bolivarian people are prepared to defend Venezuela.
All of whom are making calls today to invade our country. All of whom are making calls today to bomb our country. In the case of an event of that nature, it should be treated as an enemy of the homeland, and they should be given treatment deserving of an enemy to the homeland. They won't be governing here, not one single day.
Meanwhile, opposition leader Juan Guaido also rallied on the outskirts of the capital. He addressed his supporters regarding the recent power outage. The demonstrations were largely peaceful, but there was some tension when opposition protesters tried to stop a public metro bus on one of the main avenues in Caracas. After a standoff and threats directed at passengers, the bus continued on its way. Our correspondent Luis Tavera was with one of the first marches that set off today and sent this report.
This demonstration, called by the Chavistas, is setting off from different points of Caracas. The first contingent started from here in the west of the capital. They're supporting the workers of the Electricity Corporation for all the work they've been doing to deal with the acts of sabotage to the country's power grid. All the separate contingents are converging on the center of the city for a protest against the international attacks on Venezuela, which they say are part of a plan by the US administration to take control of Venezuela's resources. One important feature of this demonstration is the presence of many members of the People's Militia, which is an important aspect of the unity between social movements and the military, which the government has said is crucial to the defense of Venezuela's independence. They insist this is not about defending just one political party, but to defend peace and stability for all the Venezuelan people. They're also expressing their thanks for the international support given to Venezuela by, for example, allies like Russia and China, which have defended Venezuela's right to pursue the socialist model it has been promoting for the last 2 decades. We'll keep you updated as the day goes on.
We'll take a short break now. Join us again in just a minute. Welcome back. A large mobilization is being held in Washington, D.C. against this year's NATO summit. Organizers say that since its founding, NATO has been one of the world's deadliest military alliances, causing untold suffering and devastation in countries like Iraq, Libya, Somalia, and former Yugoslavia. They said the 29 NATO member countries are told they must abandon hard-won social programs in order to meet U.S. demands for military spending. Among the demands of the marchers is the shutting down of AFRICOM, the U.S. military command on the African continent. National Coordinator of Black Alliance for Peace, Ajamu Baraka, spoke outside of the White House about Venezuela's demand for peace.
We were in Venezuela just a couple of weeks ago, as many of you know, and we were given a mandate from the people in Venezuela. They said, our brother Ajamu and the rest of the delegation, go back to the U.S. with this message. They said, we want peace. We want peace. However, we are prepared for war.
That's right.
Now, that's an important message, because what they were saying was that they were prepared to defend the integrity of their process.
U.S. President Donald Trump has said he's terminating aid to El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Trump says that this decision comes as these countries are doing, quote, nothing to stop migration. According to the Department of State, in 2018, the United States delivered $120 million of aid to Guatemala, $80 million to Honduras, and $58 million to El Salvador.
They're patriots. They love our country, and they want...
Protests staged by indigenous and other movements in Colombia have entered a 20th day, with around 15,000 people so far joining the mobilization across the country. The Cauca Indigenous Council said that they will maintain and even increase road blockades on the Pan American Highway until President Ivan Duque meets with them for talks. Indigenous leaders also demanded that the government guarantees that marchers won't be prosecuted and that the military won't repress any gatherings. Our correspondent in Bogotá, Tatiana Portela, brings us the latest details.
This Saturday, a second meeting between the indigenous delegation leading the Minga movement and the Interior Minister Patricia Gutierrez took place in La Delfina in the department of Valle de Cauca. The indigenous delegation is demanding the same as before, that the government complies with more than 1,300 agreements they have signed with indigenous communities since the 1991 Constitution, that the government fulfill the agreements they reached during the National Agrarian Strike in 2013, and the promises made during 2016 National Indigenous Minga Movement. These indigenous communities are only asking the government to fulfill what it had agreed before. But President Ivan Duque refuses to meet the indigenous delegation in person until they lift the road blockades and stop pressuring the government with this protest. But the indigenous people gathering there say they are actually the ones living under constant pressure, ranging from armed conflicts and criminal gangs terrorizing their communities to extreme poverty. So far, indigenous communities from 9 departments have joined the national protest. They say that neither the relevant points of the 2016 FARC peace agreement nor Duque's national development plan have been fulfilled in their communities.
That was Tatiana Portela in Colombia. Now to Brazil, where relatives have been commemorating the victims of the dictatorship and the anniversary of the 1964 coup. The families gathered at one of the dictatorship's main detention centers to pay tribute to their loved ones. Carrying pictures of the victims, they chanted for freedom and against the current president, Jair Bolsonaro, who invited the armed forces to celebrate the coup. And controversy continues over Bolsonaro's invitation to celebrate the coup. On Friday night, a federal judge blocked the celebrations after the ombudsman's office argued that they would undermine the country's historic memory and truth. But on Saturday morning, an appeals judge overturned that decision. On March 31, 1964, the Brazilian armed forces, supported by the U.S. government, overthrew the democratically elected and left-wing president João Goulart. Opposition parties in Haiti have called for more protests against President Jovenel Moïse to demand that he steps down. The protesters are accusing Moïse of corruption and mismanagement, which they say has left millions of people in poverty. The demonstrations were initially triggered by allegations of misuse of money from the Petrocaribe Fund by top government officials. They have gone on relentlessly since February, despite attempts by the government to clamp down on protesters.
Today we are protesting against Jovenel Moïse, from him to step down and end all the lies and the stealing from Haiti's natural resources for the benefit of the U.S. In a country like Haiti, we can afford to buy food and send our kids to school.
Yellow Vest demonstrations have taken place in their 20th consecutive weekend of protests against the government of Emmanuel Macron. Almost 6,000 people joined the demonstrations across the country, with 1,800 people protesting in Paris. Demonstrations were banned from gathering in certain hotspot areas of the capital. Meanwhile, Macron is taking part in a national tour to promote a national debate.
You repress people, you pick on people. We go to work, we park, you find us, you harass us, pay this tax, that tax, and we don't leave anymore. That's why today we're like this, why we're demonstrating. As long as it doesn't stop, it's going to end in a revolution.
All is set in Ukraine for the presidential election to be held this Sunday. Presidential hopeful Yulia Tymoshenko held her final campaign rally in Kiev. Speaking to her supporters from stage, Tymoshenko stressed the need for new strategies and for solutions for peace. 39 candidates are running in this election.
Special attention will be dedicated to the creation of a powerful, modern, up-to-date army without corruption, without trade in blood, without all the outrageous conduct which happens today.
Our correspondent Hansel Oro has the details.
Ukrainians are getting ready to go to the polls on Sunday. In 2014, President Viktor Yanukovych was ousted, and since then, the country has faced a deep political crisis. The favourite to win is comedian Volodymyr Zelensky, who, according to the polls, has 30% of the votes secured, followed by Petro Poroshenko with a little more than 17% of the votes. Former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko is last in the polls with 12% of the votes. She was one of the last leaders of the Orange Revolution that took place in 2004 and was jailed for it. She was freed during the protests in 2014. Experts have said a runoff vote will most likely happen. According to the Electoral Commission, more than 2,000 observers from 16 different countries and international organisations will take part in this election. During this campaign, Petro Poroshenko has spoken about the annexation of Crimea and how to resolve the conflict in Donbass. Meanwhile, the diplomatic relations between Kiev and Moscow have worsened.
That was Hansel Oro in Moscow. Flash floods have killed at least 35 people in Afghanistan, destroying infrastructure and cutting off access to many parts of the country. Rescue teams have been dispatched to search for people who are still missing. The country has received above average amounts of rainfall and snow in recent weeks. Hundreds of cities across the world are switching off their lights to mark this year's Earth Hour, urging action to save the planet. Lights will go off at famous buildings and structures between 8:30 p.m. and 9:30 p.m. on Saturday as part of the international event organized by conservation charity Worldwide Fund for Nature. Millions of people in more than 170 countries are expected to take part this year. We've come to the end of this news brief. You can find these and many other stories on our website at telestarenglish.net. And join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Telestar English, I'm Camila Escalante. Thanks for watching.